I think you have to make it personal. Plastic is personal. Even if you don't care about the environment, even if you don't care about the pollution, even if you don't care about the wildlife it kills, you should care about what plastics is doing to your own body and the health implications that microplastics and their additive chemicals have for you. And I think that's why we're making it a very human problem. We had a report that came out in November last year called Babies versus Plastics. And that was a deliberate attempt to show people that
Welcome everyone to Planet vs. Plastics podcast series. This is your host Rumit Walia for this insightful journey into a world free from plastic pollutions. Today's episode is Media versus Plastics, and we have an amazing person from the Earth.org official team from Washington DC, Miss Sarah Davis, who is the Media Relations and Brand Management Director at Earth Day Network. And she's going to talk about how media has an influence over the world and can act as a catalyst to bring about change to combat the plastic pollution. Welcome, Sarah, to the Planet versus Plastics podcast series. And we'll start away with the very first question that everybody in the world right now knows that media has the power to inform and educate the public widely, especially about all the environmental impacts that we are having majorly because of the plastics. So, my question would be, how can media organizations and even the non-profit organizations which have media personnel can effectively communicate the urgency of reducing plastic use and its effect on the planet?
it's such a good question. And I wish I knew I had the perfect answer. I think, our job is to make people aware of the problem and assume that they don't know anything about the issues with plastics. I think if you assume people may have heard of it or they understand what a microplastic is, they get lost very quickly. So you need to speak in a language that, everybody can understand. And I think you have to make it personal. Plastic is personal. Even if you don't care about the environment, even if you don't care about the pollution, even if you don't care about the wildlife it kills, you should care about what plastics is doing to your own body and the health implications that microplastics and their additive chemicals have for you. And I think that's why we're making it a very human problem. We had a report that came out in November last year called Babies versus Plastics. And that was a deliberate attempt to show people that the people that we love most in the world, our own children, are the ones that are probably being the most impacted. And that was a very conscious decision to try and reach parents and get them to understand that this is not some faraway problem. This is not a problem that just faces people who work in the plastic industry or who live by plastic factories. It's everybody. And really to try and bring it down to that level that everyone is being impacted. So that's what we try and do.
And that's wonderful. And I think that is what media always tries to do. I mean, whatever it's communication, it's printing media or social media, electronic. I mean, nowadays social media is huge, but it reaches to everybody. And if that message, what you mentioned very nicely, that give it a personal touch, connect it to your personal health, because it's all about human survival. I mean, Earth can recreate itself, but
Yeah.
what we are doing to the species on the planet and what humans how humans have been impacted, it's not revertible, so we cannot revert it. So but how do you see that nowadays? I mean, I also remember I used to read newspapers, still do sometimes. My grandfathers used to read it a lot, but now everybody is using social media, and then
Yes.
it's a lot of fake news, a lot of misinformation. But I really love the April Fool. I mean, everybody loved the April Fool of Earth Day when they changed massday.org, and I got bunch of messages. We were shocked. We thought, what has happened? But so, how do you see that using that type of ideas on social media, specifically by the news channels and the media and people like us and the organizations like Earth Day, that huge brand is dealing nowadays with this kind of a communication?
Well, maybe first I should explain that yesterday was April Fool's Day, which is marked in a lot of countries around the world, not everywhere, but a lot, certainly in America and Europe. And the idea is that you play a joke on people, you tell them something that is not true and try and pretend that it is true. So yesterday we put out a big press release that Earth Day was rebranding to Mars Day, because we had basically given up on Earth because it was so full of plastics that we were going to try and go to a planet and rally behind a planet that had no plastics. Yeah, it was a deliberate attempt. We're not trying to trivialize the issues of climate change or plastic or anything. It's not about that. What it's about is saying we're trying to reach a younger audience who maybe had never heard of Earth Day, who maybe hadn't heard of earthday.org, and trying to make them go, what is this? And then hopefully some of them will convert that interest into coming to the site, seeing what we're doing, getting involved. And I think also it was a nod to the people who do know about Earth Day and care about, what we do, to say, we're with you. We get it. We're all
Yeah.
frustrated. And sometimes you have to laugh, because if you don't, you'll cry. And I think it was just, we got a lot of our friends and colleagues in other organizations thought it was hilarious and they were posting it. We had a couple of people who thought it was really serious and were like, "Why are you doing it? Don't go." So yeah, it was a really good reaction, but it was a deliberate attempt to just do something very simple. We weren't hectoring or yelling or shouting. We were just making a point in a very funny way. And sometimes humor is just a really good way of doing it, and it can be kind of universal if it's very simple. So that was the thinking behind it. So I'm sorry if we instigated you getting lots of emails going, what is happening?
But I think those ideas are required nowadays to catch the attention of people.
Yeah,
Sometimes even youth we have been doing this podcast, and many of the youth that have been watching this have mentioned that most of the stuff that they see on internet is usually similar. Every day they see plastic is everywhere. This is the
yeah.
problem. But then they needed a twist so that they get this. Oh, this is serious, and we have to do something like that.
You know what it reminds me of? It's the same thing that Rupu does, the plug man of India, that
Yes,
he he couldn't get people to turn up for the cleanups, but he could get them to turn up for the exercise. And
yes,
that's what he did. He turned picking up trash into some really fun event that was actually very good for you. And he did the same thing, and he did it brilliantly. Like, we're so impressed with what he's done. And you're right. Sometimes you do need to shift like 10-20% that way, because the message about plastics, I think, is getting out there now. And you're right. After a while, if it's just the same message told in the same way, you can tune it out. So we're always trying to think of ways to tune people back in again. I give you another good example, actually. It's been really shocking to watch, Her Royal Highness the Princess of Wales announce that she had cancer. And we don't know what cancer she has, and we don't know what caused it. But we do know that there is a rise in young people under the age of 50 getting cancer. And there is now some conversations swirling around that perhaps microplastics might be one of the environmental factors that is, forcing cancer numbers up in young people. Now, we don't know if that's true. We don't know if there's a causal link, but I do think it's a really good way of focusing people again on what is happening right now. So even
yeah,
if you, again, it gets back to that, even if you don't care about the environment, you may well know someone who's got cancer who's very young, and you probably are wondering why have they got it. I mean, I know people that are very young and have got it, and I'm wondering. And I do think that's um, a fair thing to do, is to speculate, well, what might be triggering it. And it's interesting. I was reading a lot of reports last weekend, and they were all saying there must be some environmental factors that doctors have not factored into this whole cancer thing. It's
yeah,
not just diet. It's not just genetics. It's not just,
yes.
exercise. It's not just your alcohol consumption. There is something else.
Something else.
And that something else, I think, could be microplastics and
Yeah,
the chemicals that you basically absorb from the plastics, because we know a lot of them are carcinogenic and are very toxic. And I think that is a fair question. So you can take a big headline story and you can look at it through the lens of, the plastic campaign. And I think it changes the story slightly. It makes it much more real. It just makes it
yeah,
much more real. So
yeah,
I think we're always trying to do that within the realms of science. We never want to speculate on nonsense, and we try and make all the reports, everything that
yeah.
we write, all has to be sourced. But yeah, there is a lot of media attention on these young people getting cancer, and I think that eventually more people are going to pivot to the idea that it might have something to do with these microplastics and the
Yeah.
chemicals that come out of them.
And it wouldn't come as a shock even if that news comes in, because nowadays everybody knows that it has made into our bloods and mother's milk, and then it's everywhere. It was a few years ago, it was just outside in front of our eyes. Now it's inside our bodies as well. So plastic is literally everywhere.
Everywhere. And I think that what's interesting is someone said to me the other day, well, why is this generation potentially being the one that's made ill by it? And I think it's really, when you think about it, it's kind of obvious. Plastics has been around since the 1950s, and
Yeah,
it takes that amount of time for it to start breaking down into microplastics.
microplastics.
And
Yeah,
probably now there's more microplastics in the environment than there's ever been in human history. And we're eating them, absorbing them, drinking them, inhaling them in the air. So it's this younger generation that are essentially taking on more microplastics than ever before. And that's why, when I was younger, they just plastic hadn't been around long enough to
yeah,
accumulate in the environment the way it is now. But now it's 70 years later, and so that's 70 years of endless plastic production. And if you think every year we create 400 million tons
million
of
tons of
plastic,
plastic things.
and
Yeah,
every single bit of plastic ever produced is still on this planet.
yes,
That's a lot of plastic that's accumulated over time and broken down and got into the water system. But I do think one thing that people they get confused by is the microplastics breaks down into particles, so kind of little tiny fragments of
yeah,
plastic, some of which you can't see. It's they're nanoplastics almost, that you'd need a microscope to see them. They're there, we just can't see them with our eyes. But the other thing that the microplastics do, which I think is really terrifying, is they leach out the chemicals that were put into
into
the
them.
oil
Yeah,
essentially to make the plastic. And then what they do is, they kind of like, the microplastics act like little kind of delivery services, taking those chemicals everywhere. And I think that's what's so insidious about it, that they can get in everywhere, from, the Antarctic to Everest to the bottom of the ocean, inside us, and all these chemicals are just leaching out. And the plastic industry does not have to test if those chemicals, are dangerous for human consumption, because the assumption is you're not going to eat the plastic.
yeah,
I don't think they realize when they made plastic that it's not inert. It breaks down. That plastic bottle looks like it's completely solid and it'll never break down, but it does break down
it
over
does. It
time.
does.
And they didn't realize that. Now they know. I mean, and I'm pretty sure the plastic industry knows that now. And
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
like,
yeah.
what are they doing?
Yeah, exactly. And you very correctly said that plastic is not going anywhere. It's not like
No.
we can throw it in the space and it vanishes away. It actually also stays in the space, for that matter. So
Yeah.
even on Earth, like we are just shifting it from one place to another, maybe one phase to another. But I think after, it is not decomposable at all. Even if it does, it takes thousands and more than 500 years at least. And I don't know what kind of generation would be at that time. Uh,
Yeah, I know.
if this is the time where we're getting cancer out of it, I don't know if we will even be able to survive. So
Well, I think that's why, earthday.org, and I think a lot of the other organizations believe so strongly that the only way we can get ourselves out of the mess that we've kind of got ourselves into with plastics is to break the plastic addiction.
yeah,
We use plastic so casually, and we shouldn't be using it so casually. And we shouldn't be producing so much. And we have to challenge the plastic industry, which, by the way, is the fossil fuel industry. Exxon is the biggest manufacturer of single use plastic in the world. We have to challenge them when they talk about circular, economies, and we can recycle. Well, we're not recycling.
yeah,
Only 5% of plastic was recycled in
recycled.
America, or has been 9% globally, I think, which is pathetic. That means the vast majority of plastic is never recycled. And even when it's recycled, it still
It's
exists as
still here.
plastic.
Yeah,
Yeah, we're not getting rid of it.
yeah,
It's not turning into trees.
yeah,
So I think we just have to have a kind of like a really honest conversation. And of course, we know the history of the fossil fuel industry is they're often not very forthcoming or honest about what they know. We know that Exxon knew that greenhouse gases were having an impact on climate change. It's been discovered that they knew for a long, long
yeah.
time before they told anyone. So I think our question is, what do the plastic industry know about microplastics? Like, what research have they done? What do they actually know about the impact they have on human beings? And do they know if there is a causal link between microplastics, the additive chemicals they use to make them, and all these health issues we're now seeing? Because that's the silver bullet that's missing right now. We don't know
Yeah.
how these chemicals and plastics are working inside our bodies. I think we will get that science, and I think that people are working on it now, and I think
Yeah,
we
it's
will
just a
get those
matter of
answers.
time, I'm sure.
It's a matter of time, but I do wonder what the plastic industry know already, if they know more than they tell us. So
And I think that's where the media can also play a huge role, getting that information out from the corporates and the industries, ki what exactly is happening and putting it out in the world. That everybody, it's not like if I'm in Delhi, India, and you're in US, we all are getting impacted equally by the plastic. And this has,
yes, well, I
yeah,
mean, although the one thing I would say, Rumit, is that I think certain communities, underprivileged communities and the communities that live near the sites of the plastic
yeah,
manufacturing, they are definitely much more impacted
impacted,
because
yeah,
often those sites pollute into the soil and the water around where they live. So some communities are paying an even heavier price for this plastics pollution and poisoning. So yeah, there's a lot to be done. I'm a former journalist myself. I'm very grateful for all the great journalism that's being done out there. I looked at papers like The Guardian, and I think they've done an amazing job highlighting this story. But I do wonder why the BBC hasn't talked about it more. I wonder why CNN hasn't talked about it more. I look to the broadcasters and I think, why aren't you talking about this situation
yeah,
more? And I think it's because sometimes they're just a little bit naive almost. Like they're very focused on climate change and they're not talking about a lot of the other issues underneath. And I think the naivety comes in the sense that, plastic production, for example, is part of the climate change problem too. But they
yes.
never join the dots on that. I think right now plastic production, it contributes 4% of greenhouse gases
Oh God.
annually, and that's going to rise, possibly treble by
Yeah,
2060 as production of plastic goes up. I don't hear, I don't hear, enough journalists talking about that. I think they think it's almost like a niche subject. And personally, I think that plastics is the biggest health experiment on human beings there's ever been. It's much worse than lead or tobacco or pesticides and insecticides because none of us can opt out of plastic. I mean, even if you say, I want to live a plastic free life, you can't
yeah,
because
it's
there's
everywhere.
plastic everywhere. So
Yeah,
that's why I do feel like it really does need to get more attention.
yes,
So I appeal to the journalists in India, get more involved, write about it more,
yes,
BBC India,
everybody
tell
should.
this story. Yeah.
So I mean, this year theme is also planet versus plastics of Earth Day. So this would be my last question. Also, it has been very wonderful, insightful conversation, I can say. So, what are the plans? Like, more than 50,000 partners we have. We are in 195 countries, and
Yeah.
everybody commemorates Earth Day. So, what is
No.
that big media plan that is in our mind by which we can push this problem of plastic and ask media personnel to cover this on this Earth Day and maybe beyond that as well?
It's interesting, you it's such a good question. You can't, I mean, a billion people mark Earth Day annually
Yeah,
every year now, which is remarkable. So we have various campaign teams that lead certain parts of the kind of like the Earth Day. So Michael runs our Great Global Cleanup, and that's a really great way for people to get involved in Earth Day. If you come to the earthday.org map, there's a great site where you can log in that
yeah,
you're going to do a cleanup, and that generates a lot of partnerships, and he runs this amazing kind of like group, thousands of partners all getting involved around the world. Evan runs the partnerships with, other civil societies and NGOs and other organizations and finds out what they're doing. We reach out to all the media that we possibly can. We make sure the team are out there. And Aidan, who's our director of End
yes,
Plastic Initiatives, is booked everywhere talking about it. So, we really rely on so many other organizations and people to spread the word and get the message out there, which they do
yes,
brilliantly. And you're right, on the 22nd of April, everyone is going to be marking Earth Day. We just ask that they really try and give people actions they can do, things they can actively do to really try and combat plastics. So, sign the petition, do a cleanup, ask your local politicians to legislate against plastics. Just be more cognitive that plastic is not a natural substance and there's just too much of it. So we have a whole kind of toolkit of things people can do. And India is one of the places that goes nuts for Earth Day. Like, it's amazing. Every year we're like, oh my God, we can't believe the amount of things you're doing. So, and you run an amazing team over there. So it's about trying to, wrangle all our partners and get everybody to give the same message. And this message this year is planet versus plastics, which I think really has resonated. Like, I do
Yes.
think people are beginning to take it on board that, wow, this is a big issue. So yeah, it's always slightly chaotic and busy, but brilliant. One final thing I would say is this year, which is totally, it's just coincidence, but Earth Day falls over the great global plastic treaty negotiations that are going on in Ottawa. So all the world's governments are coming together in Ottawa from the 21st to the 27th of April to discuss plastics. So we're Earth Day is literally the
Yeah.
second day of those
Amazing.
negotiations. So the lot of the team, a lot of your colleagues are all going to be, including me, we're all going to be in Ottawa campaigning. So that's an extra kind of like an extra level of like I suppose activism that we didn't have last year. But yeah, we'll all be
It's like
out
the universe
campaigning.
is actually telling us that you need to connect the dots, everyone, and then just push it as much as you can. So
That's
it's
how I think of
amazing.
it
Yeah.
too.
So that has been amazing, Sarah. Thank you so much for joining this, and it has been very insightful. I'm sure people would learn a lot about it, and they'll have that passion and that wave. Let's do more this Earth Day about planet versus plastics. And thank you for joining.
Thank you for having me. It's lovely to see you. Bye,
Yeah.
Rumit.
Okay. And for the audience, keep it clean, keep it green, and remember, every day is Earth Day.